I want to read you from a little bit of Judge Reinhart's order. He says, I find that the government has met its burden of showing a compelling reason and good cause to seal portions of the affidavit because disclosure would reveal, 1, the identities of witnesses, law enforcement agents, and uncharged parties. 2, the investigation's strategy, direction, scope, sources, and methods. And 3, grand jury information protected by the Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure. Tell me about what we learned today from what will be released the less than 24 hours from now.
So we learned, Nicole, basically that the Justice Department won today, as expected. And the judge in that passage you're reading says that he agrees with the Justice Department's redactions, the blacking out of certain parts of the affidavit. And I wouldn't be remotely surprised if the Justice Department proposed blacking out huge chunks of the affidavit because it'd be irresponsible for them to risk the disclosure of key witnesses or grand jury information or anything like that at this point in the investigation. So now what happens here is the Justice Department could appeal because there is a principle at stake, which is we don't release affidavits, period. And that is basically the department's general position. As you said, it's incredibly rare for any sort of release, even a partial release, to happen. But sitting in the chair of the Solicitor General, which I used to do, I don't think I would appeal this just because, again, the Justice Department got everything they wanted. And as Carol says, it's an unprecedented investigation. Now, on the other hand, news organizations could appeal, and I expect them to because they want to see more information. That's kind of, their function and so on. So, I wouldn't be surprised if we see an appeal to the 11th Circuit. But there's one last point I'd make about this, which is I think the Justice Department won in a totally different way today, because I think that what those proposed redactions are going to be tomorrow, the part that's not redacted that we'll all get to see, I suspect it's going to have some damning information about Donald Trump. It's one thing for the department to protect sources and methods, witnesses, grand jury information, all that kind of stuff. That's what the redactions are. But I expect in that affidavit to be a good discussion of all of the attempts that the Justice Department and FBI had to try and retrieve these documents from Mar-a-Lago, what they thought was there, what they were hearing was there, and that President Trump was thumbing his nose at them. And that part, I suspect, will come out, maybe as early as tomorrow. And it underscores what Merrick Garland is doing here. He's just following the rules, but he's winning by following the rules. The rules are you don't leak information, you don't release the affidavit and the like. But here a court is ordering that to happen. And it parallels something that happened yesterday, which I know we'll be talking about later, which is the release of the Barr memo on whether President Trump could be indicted for the Russia investigation. Again, Garland could have released that, but he waited for a court to force his hand. That's standard DOJ process and procedure, and it now allows us all to look at that. And boy, that's pretty damning about Donald Trump, too.
Neil, we're going to get into its substance in a minute, but you're making an important point that Garland isn't guided by the substance of any of these documents. He's guided by the principle of their protection and privacy. Will you just expand on that?
Yeah, the department generally has views, for example, in this affidavit. If you have a law enforcement investigation, you don't want your affidavit justifying the search, which is filed ex parte, which means the other side doesn't get to see it. It's just a federal judge or federal magistrate judge that gets to see it for good reason, because if people could see it, they'd hide documents, they'd intimidate witnesses, they do all the kind of stuff that Donald Trump is known to do, not just in the Trump case, but investigation after investigation across the country. So the department had a really important principle at stake when it started this litigation to say, look, we do not want a federal court ordering us to release any information. The judge then came back and said, look, if I'm going to have to release some, tell me what I can release without doing harm to your investigation. And that's what the department filed earlier today. And that's what the judge accepted. So the department followed its principle to the letter, not just protecting this investigation, but future ones. But now, as a result, I suspect some bad information about Donald Trump to come out tomorrow in that affidavit. Again, just following what the judge's orders were. And this just underscores, Donald Trump has, some lawyers on the team which are actually, harming his interests, but they're not careful about what they're asking for. And this is a good illustration of it.
Ben Rhodes, Neil brought the Bill Barr Justice Department into the conversation, and so I want to stay there. One of the things, we keep talking about being in uncharted territory as a country, covering a search approved by a judge of an ex-president's home, not the what of it, but why, because he had classified materials that could endanger U.S. national security in his possession. And the surveillance footage we know from what has come out shows people not just moving these boxes around, but repackaging some of the materials that may or may not be classified. It makes me want to know a whole lot more about what he was protected from while he was there, about how these agencies function when he was in this much trouble but had all the protections of the executive. What do you think when you see this investigation start to, maybe the tip of the iceberg reveal itself?
I'm really glad you asked that question, Nicole, because this is what I've been thinking about the last couple of days. Because, for 8 years, I was in a White House with the highest security clearance. And then for the first year after we left the White House, I stayed on with President Obama for a year. And the important thing for people to understand is the transition from January 20th, 2017, for me, to January 21st was very dramatic because, and for President Obama, even more dramatic, because you go as president, you go from being on top of a massive infrastructure that includes the White House staff and all the various departments of government to just having a few staffers working for you. And by the way, those staffers do not have security clearances. So there are two elements of this. First is I lost my security clearance the day I walked out of the White House. I actually had to testify in front of some of the Russia investigations in Congress. And even though it was dealing with documents that I'd seen and events that I'd lived through, I had to get a security clearance on a temporary basis just to read the same documents that I was familiar with from being in government. And I make that point because none of these people who were around Donald Trump presumably had those security clearances. So anybody who had custody of these documents, who was moving documents, who was rifling through documents, more likely than not, those are not people that were cleared to be doing that. And then the second piece that you alluded to that's so important is that Donald Trump, for all of his incompetence and risk-taking and criminality, for 4 years, he had an enormous infrastructure of people essentially running interference for him. In the case of the White House counsel's office, trying, often not successfully, but trying to keep him from committing crimes or violating norms or violating protocols. That entire infrastructure around Donald Trump went away the second that he walked out of the White House. No longer was there a Bill Barr there to kind of run interference for him on the Russia investigation in a clever way. No longer was there even a Pat Cipollone there to tell him when he was about to be committing a crime, even if he didn't care about it. So I think what we're seeing and experiencing is this really was just Donald Trump stripped of all the powers and protections and infrastructure of the presidency, violating the law because he's with people and he's in a facility where he's not supposed to have an enormous volume of classified documents. And frankly, without people with any experience or expertise to keep him from walking into the legal, huge troubled waters that he's in right now. And so I think it speaks to what happens when you pull back the veil from the Wizard of Oz here. And there's just Donald Trump and a handful of flunkies out in Mar-a-Lago who are breaking the law and not playing like they should with the Justice Department.